I'd like to first begin with Mr. Marks. Mr. Marks, you made an interesting statement when you said that the 2006 amendment altered the MSA, but what we did was to adopt the Alaska model without the science of Alaska. And I'm also curious about that statement, and tied to that, the fact that you believe that the Act now requires basically catch limits on every type of fish. Did I hear you correctly?
That's correct, you did. I think we did try and apply the Alaska model because Senator Stevens was heavily engaged in the reauthorization, and Alaska has been held up as the model in the country for fisheries management, and I think the focus was to try and move the rest of the country more towards that. And as I indicated, the biggest concern with that is that the high exemplary scientific capabilities of the Alaska region did not follow to the rest of the country. We're lacking, and that means that without the sufficient science, the precautionary buffers that are now added to these ACL requirements are extremely large. Even if we set general proxies for stocks we don't know much about, that we have to be extra precautionary under the way the Act was interpreted.
So to then address for example, Hawaii doesn't, I'm from Hawaii, Hawaii doesn't have technically overfished stock. So if you're going to set, or under how you interpret the law, if they're going to then set, quote, limits, then it's sort of a situation where how do they get, well, I like to understand from you how you believe they can get to the point of setting a limit when the stock isn't overfished.
Well, I'm not arguing that they shouldn't set limits. My point is that they should set appropriate limits based on the scientific information that they have. You're lucky that you don't have any overfished stocks, apparently, but they still have to set limits on those stocks based on the information that they have at hand. If they don't have sufficient information, they still have to set an ACL limit based on whatever information they have, as maybe weak, maybe strong, but they still have to set that limit, and then fishermen have to abide by that.
Do you feel that if it's not overfished that you need to set a limit?
Do I feel if it's not overfished, do we need to set a limit? I don't have a problem with setting a limit if the stock is not overfished to make sure that we don't overfish that stock. Again, it gets back to the fact that we should set an appropriate one.
Why do you believe that the Alaska model has good science and other regions have not been able to duplicate that level of information? Because it seems like if you're going to set limits for Hawaii, for example, we don't have the situation overfished. I'm really concerned if we don't have the Alaska science to then go and help them establish those limits.
Mr. Oliver would love this question, but I can tell you that from the economy of scale, some of the largest and most economically valuable fisheries in the country take place off the coast of Alaska. They have their own science center. They have most of the stock assessments done on a more regular basis than any other region in the country. And again, I'm not arguing that they do a wonderful job up there. We need to do that everywhere else in Hawaii and on the East Coast and in the Gulf. We just don't have the capability.
And that was actually a great segue, because I was going to ask Mr. Oliver, what makes it so that Alaska has this great science? And your testimony is clearly, I think, from someone's perspective who has the great science. And of course, this doesn't bother you as much as it bothers everyone else. So can you tell me how is it that you have the great science that nobody else has?
Well, I don't know that I can fully answer. I think Mr. Marks hit upon it. We have our Alaska Fisheries Science Center. We've had the luxury of having that relatively well funded. We've had a lot of ship time and regular surveys in the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. Hopefully we'll be able to continue. That was one of the points of my testimony, was the need to enhance stock assessments in regions where you don't have that, but we also want to keep the robust stock assessments that we have, and it's an expensive process. We also have some fisheries that happen to be more amenable to stock assessment surveys. Pollock, for example, one of our largest fisheries, a lot of that survey information comes from hydroacoustic surveys rather than having to do ultra-also surveys. So some of them lend themselves better to stock assessments. And
isn't it kind of ironic? I mean, usually when we set standards, we don't set to the highest standard because it seems just unfair for everyone else to have to achieve to that level, because what you have is a lot of equipment and a lot of centers that no one else has. But anyway, with that, I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you made a statement that it may not be appropriate for every fishery to use catch shares, and I was curious about that. Why that statement, and under what circumstances do you believe that it would not be appropriate for every fishery to use catch shares?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So there's been much suggestion, including in some of the earlier testimony today, that in some fashion the agency is forcing upon the councils or the fishermen the implementation of catch share systems, and we've been very clear that we see a catch share based approach as a viable tool that should be considered for a lot of fisheries, but it is not necessarily one that the council should use in every case, or one that we would advocate be used in every case. And even in those cases where they are utilized, we strongly support their local design and implementation to ensure that appropriate conditions and sideboards are set to protect local economic and other social desires, and that's something that we've strongly advocated throughout. Certainly, as you move from and they're most readily used and most clearly effective with respect to commercial fisheries. There has been a lot of discussion about the ways in which they might affect recreational for hire fisheries and in mixed stock fisheries, and that's something that we also believe should be considered very carefully at the local level. One of the,
I don't know who it was that was testifying, when we were looking at this whole issue, the question came up with the science, right? And it's all based on science. And then we see the disparity between Alaska, for example, which is I guess, what we should all try to aspire to, and other areas which doesn't have the resources to do that science. So how then do you put together the science, which is going to then determine the concept of how we would have a catch share, for example, or probably whether an alternative should be used to catch share, when the science in and of itself is questionable in many of the areas? Have you had to deal with that?
Yes, thank you. So maybe just to, I agreed with the vast majority of what Mr. Oliver had to say when he spoke to the situation in Alaska versus the situation in other places. He, I think, alluded to, and what I would focus on a little more directly is the fact that in many places, particularly in the South Atlantic, the Gulf, and in Hawaii, we have fish stocks that don't lend themselves as readily to the kinds of surveys that are used in Alaska, and those present some unique challenges. We have worked to invest over a period of years much more aggressively in some new on-the-water surveys, as well as some new assessment efforts in some of those places, so that we could try to bring up to more effectively up to speed our level of our assessment capabilities in some of those other places, and I think we're making some headway there.
One of the interesting two pieces of legislation is Mr. Frank's and Mr. Keating's, and that's regarding basically the forfeiture fund, and putting that money, Mr. Frank's situation, putting that money into the states to assist with research and science. How much of that would be helpful, and alternatively, how much of that would really help us build the science that we're all seeking to understand here?
So I would make 2 points. I mean, I think that maybe 3 points. First of all, we certainly appreciate the sentiment around more investment needed in science. And in a corollary to that, we work very closely with our state partners to utilize their science and to work very collaboratively on management processes. Having said that, I think that the amount of money that might be available in the asset forfeiture fund, frankly, should not be overestimated in its ability to affect that science challenge. And then finally, I would note, as I did in my testimony, that a good and effective fishery management system depends upon sound science, effective management, and good compliance. And so if we rob from the compliance end to build up the science end, it might be that we end up with a result that's not what we're all looking for.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. Thank you, Ms. Hanabusa.